Eskom's new grid connection rules are receiving resistance from independent power producers, and it forces them to do most of the work even before knowing if the grid connections exist. The South African Independent Power Producers Association calls it erroneous and irrational. We have their chairperson, Brian Day, joining us in studio. Good morning to you, Brian, and thanks so much for your time. What are the rules, maybe, before we even go there, the context of why the independent power producers exist in the first place?
Good morning and good morning to all the listeners. The context really is that over the last 12 years or so, there have been a lot of independent power producers being connected to the grid. An independent power producer, simply a private company that invests in power generation capacity, but Eskom still owns the grid, both transmission and distribution. 12 years ago or so, Eskom set up the grid access unit, and they've done an amazing job. Hundreds of applications, over 100 independent power producers have been connected to the grid. We get to a stage now, though, where that available capacity is starting to become in extreme short supply, specifically in areas where there's very good resource capacity for wind and solar. They are now in a corner to have to be seen to be fair in allocating who gets the opportunity to connect or not. Their intention is to move from a first apply to a first ready principle. The objective of that is to make sure that as much of the new capacity that can be brought onto the grid is brought on as soon as possible. However, in that process, they've created a very onerous situation for independent power producers, because developing a project like this is really all about parallel processes. You have to do all of the different development activities, from environmental assessments, water use license, legal aspects, off-take, technical aspects, all at once, and you spend money to reduce the risk in different areas in parallel. The new rules put the grid connection right at the end of the process, requiring us to spend a lot of money up front before you know that you really can get grid access.
All right, but we're talking about capacity, as you were saying. We're essentially just waiting for Eskom to then latch on the independent power producers onto the grid. But what you need to do is to be shovel ready. As an independent power producer, you need to have developed the technology infrastructure and constructed the plant for you to be able to get on the grid, if I'm understanding you.
Absolutely. But the key is to be able to do all of those things in parallel so that you get ready as soon as possible. If you put the grid connection right at the end, you then do everything else and then wait only for that one activity. It also means that you've spent the additional money up front. So in the long term, between Eskom and private sector, collaboratively, we need to radically expand the grid to enable many, many more projects. So not just to wait for a new generation opportunity to provide the grid access or the grid connection infrastructure for that project, but actually to develop the grid in anticipation of the enormous quantum of new generation capacity that we need.
Out of curiosity, the ratio of funding for the independent power producers, my understanding is that you would then bid on an open and transparent tender process as an independent power producer, and then you allocated that based on your capacity, technical expertise, know-how, etc. Is that correct, that Eskom essentially would pay for the infrastructure almost 100%?
That's the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, a very long acronym, REAP, has worked like that the off-taker is Eskom. But there are now also very many private off-takes. So a lot of the big corporates, whether it's mining houses, synthetic fuels, whichever, are also now procuring from independent power producers. And part of the challenge is to get the rules between the two processes also to be fair, because the obligation on Eskom under their distribution license is fair and transparent access to the grid for all parties. Okay. Non-discriminatory is the legal terminology.
All right, so while you're busy dealing with the administrative side and legalities of it, what we want to know as consumers, how far are we in ensuring that we have a sustainable energy supply system with all these other elements being added to the grid?
The reality is that we're in a crisis, not just short-term, but medium-term and long-term. In addition to the immediate crisis that we're all very well aware of in terms of load shedding, in the medium term, a lot of Eskom's coal plants are also reaching the end of life. It's not a climate change issue, it's not a preference for renewables, it's simply the fact that they were built 40, 50, 60 years ago and they're getting to the end of their life. That has to be replaced. You then also have to realize that for every megawatt of a coal plant that you decommission, you have to build approximately 3 gigawatts of a renewables plant. That's just the reality of how the technology works, capacity factor, when the wind blows, when the sun shines. So even Eskom's transmission development plan, which is outstanding work, says that we need to develop 52 gigawatts of new capacity over the next 10 years. In the context of that, just to give the numbers some meaning, we've built 6.3 gigawatts over the last 12 years. So Eskom's number under the TDP is 52 gigawatts. Others will say 50 gigawatts. The Energy Council says between 50 and 60 gigawatts by 2030. We have to ramp up our capacity in both Eskom and the private sector to design and build enormous capacity. So there's both a short-term need and to dish out the sort of scraps of the existing grid connection capacity that's available, but there's a much bigger problem to actually expand grid fundamentally for the new capacity required.
Yeah, but also depending on who you listen to or who the audience is, I guess, where the minister would say one thing, you know, in terms of support of the independent power producers, but also make an emphasis that we are a developmental country that requires to have a consistent, not intermittent energy supply, which means there is room for coal and nuclear, even in the grid. So how much more does that put a spanner in the works for the IPPs?
The word you mentioned, intermittent. Many people watching who know me will know immediately that I'll challenge that word, because renewables is not intermittent. Intermittent suggests that it suddenly, without warning, disappears. It's not, it's predictable, but variable. But the variability can be modeled. And when you have many plants of different technologies, you get a certain security of supply, together with storage. We've already got 2.7 gigawatts of pump storage, and backup capacity, something like gas supply, with enough capacity installed, but not necessarily a high utilization. That's how a system needs to be designed. That's how the RP works. It is true that coal will be with us for a while. Some of the newest coal plants are only just finishing being commissioned now, but it's also true that we've got cheaper alternatives, not just because of climate change, but renewables is known to be cheaper. However, you've got to look at what it gives you and what it doesn't give you. The variability means you also need other things. You also need technical elements called inertia and fault levels and other things that the technical guys will talk to. So you can't necessarily directly compare a tariff for a renewable plant with a coal plant, but within the system that's modelled, you can get both the least cost and security of supply that's needed.
All right, before we let you go, so what happens next now that you're saying that the rules could potentially scare off IPPs?
I've had a discussion with the head of the Grid Access Unit yesterday. We've agreed that we will submit a document with the challenges, what they've put in the rules, what we would like to see, and we will have a further meeting later this week.
All right, we'll watch that space. But thanks indeed for coming into studio this morning. We're speaking to the South African Independent Power Producers Association's Chairperson, Brian Day, on the new rules Eskom has now imposed on the independent power producers. So do stay with us.